Many years ago, I lost my voice. I could still sing and laugh and shout and whisper, yet I lost my voice in a different, deeper, and sadder way. I grew up in South Africa, and after graduating in theatre in 1994, I set off to travel the world, eventually settling in Bergen, Norway. Wasting no time, I began to learn the local language while seeking my tribe and like-minded fellow theatre lovers. Navigating a foreign country and looking for work, I was eager to impress and be noticed. As occurs in many cities around the world, there was a regular comedy improvisation night held a few times a month in Bergen. I began attending, initially only as an audience, still too insecure to perform. Until one day, when I dusted off my nervous jitters and braved the stage. For those of you who are not familiar with comedy improvisation, it requires two or more performers to improvise any given scenario through physicality and dialogue, and typically in a quick, fast-paced, and agile manner. A skilled improviser can leave you astounded by the hilarious skills and quick thinking skills they display. It's not an easy thing to do. And so I entered the stage with my two fellow improvisers, butterflies flapping in my belly, and with courageous resolve. The scenarios were chosen, the roles were allocated, and the action began. The only problem was that my Norwegian language skills were at an infant stage. And when it came my turn to perform and to improvise, I stalled, searching desperately for Norwegian words to speak. But nothing came. Nothing. At that point, not even English words. This is indeed an actor's worst nightmare. Frozen faces and a dreaded silence filled the room and consumed me. The cringe factor increased dramatically. I felt my body fill with breathless embarrassment, even shame. And in that moment, it happened. I felt my theatre voice recoil and slowly slink down my throat, plop into my belly, curling up and falling asleep for at least 7 years. That night, I lost my voice in the rush of improvisation. But I found it again many years later in the stillness of slow movement. My life continued relatively disinterested in theatre for well over half a decade. I dabbled in philosophy, anthropology, and had many adventures in travel and snowboarding. But for many years I carried with me that silent voice, and the pain of repression was a knot in my stomach that I had to bear. Until one day, when I was introduced to a Russian paradigm in theatre making, which was completely fresh and revolutionary to me, and impossible to ignore. My previous disillusionment with theatre was quickly replaced with a profound curiosity for what lay waiting to be discovered, and the slumbering voice in my belly began to stir and wake once again as the whispers of theatre lured me back in. My Russian teacher, Yuri Olchitz, a brilliant man, would often talk about theatre in a poetic way, as an esteemed and sacred art. He changed my life with one simple philosophical question. What is your theatre? What is my theatre? You mean I have a choice? Ultimately, I came to understand this question as an invitation. I had a choice to expose myself to different forms of performance expression, to adventure within and discover my own unique aesthetic world, to not only look outwards for inspiration and validation, but to search inwards for the impulses that fed my creative being. We always have that choice. The choice to be curious, to slow down and listen, and to have the courage to act. Your voice has its own theatre. What is your theatre? Guided by an intense philosophical inquiry, my introduction to Russian theatre kept gifting me with incredible gems of artistic tools. One simple yet profound technique we learned was the performative practice of stretching time to acquire a deliberate quality of slowness and receptivity. Yuri would often send us away for hours at a time to investigate blank pages and empty spaces. And in these elongated moments, movement and imagination begins to merge, and a palette of expressive possibilities begins to percolate. Inspired by these and many other aesthetic experiences, my journey took me to Tokyo, where I was to begin an 8-month theatre fellowship through the International Theatre Institute of Japan. And this life-changing, incredible opportunity gifted me with the task of researching and practicing 2 completely different, yet surprisingly complementary forms of Japanese theatre. On the one hand, Japanese No theatre, at 600 years old, is the oldest major theatre art still regularly performed today. No is highly codified, formalized, and ritualized, and embraces an economy of movement. In No, they say, feel 10 and show 7. And this principle of restrained intensity permeates throughout the No repertoire. The experience for both performer and audience can be a rather trance-like and otherworldly captivation. The second theatre art that I encountered was Japanese Buto. Buto emerged out of a post-nuclear Japanese society in 1959 and was a simultaneous rejection of Western materialism and a rebellion against the traditional rigid forms of theatre in Japan at the time. Whereas No was highly formalized, Buto gave birth to a postmodern aesthetic, typically and often characterized by hyper-slow movements and intensely distorted physical expressions. The dance of darkness, as it is often called, where the silent voices lying hidden beneath the skin find form. Buto attracts a niche audience. I was once told that if 60% of the audience left midway through a Buto performance, something that often happened in the old days, then the remaining audience would be considered the cream of the crop. In this slow, intense aesthetic of Buto, the audience is invited to take a step closer and to drop deeper into the shared, suspended moment. It was through practicing No and Buto that I ultimately discovered the real magic of slow movement. And it was on these exotic stages where my voice fully woke up. In these elastic landscapes, the world steps aside for a moment, and the usual sense of time dissolves. Your breath deepens as the quality of your awareness increases. Time slows down. I'm reminded of something the somatics pioneer Moshe Feldenkrais once said. Do it slowly. Slowly. So slowly that it will be boring. And when you begin to become bored, you will find that it really is not so boring. Through slow movement, you may drop into a liminal space, a state ripe with the potential for profound choice and change. It's a beautiful word, liminality. It's derived from the word limen, which means a border between one thing and another, or a threshold between one world and another world. Liminality is a state of temporary liberation from the expectations and norms of everyday life, ripe with a potential transformation. Shedding of the old and a ripening of the new. As anthropologist Victor Turner phrased it, liminality is in betwixt and in between the present and the future. Many of us live in an overstimulated society where our nervous systems operate above the baseline of ease and calm. In this context, I consider slow movement, which I also refer to as slow space, to be a form of personal performance activism. Slow space is a rejection of a materialistic, self-centered, disconnected society and culture. Slow space is an antidote to a fast-moving world. I also consider slow movement to be a rebellion against the habitual ways in which we move our body, and a rebellion against the patterns of a disembodied relationship with our senses and the world around us. As we move slowly, breath and movement sink, and our senses begin to come alive. We encounter ourselves anew. The way we move our body changes. Through this counterintuitive practice of slow movement, we hack the unconscious neurological networks that keep us swirling in emotional reactivity. We generate the capacity for more intentional responses. And over time, our reactive tendencies become replaced with thoughtful responses. Slow movement is espoused by many, many movement modalities around the world, of course. Yoga, Tai Chi, Ho or Mana Mana, or Feldenkrais, to name a few. Many experts suggest that these typically slow methods increase the parasympathetic nervous response, which in turn reduces the stress response. It promotes healing and stimulates the immune function as well. Many teachers believe that we should slow down mentally, but disregard slowing down physically too. I consider this a flawed strategy. Instead, I suggest that if we first embody the experience of moving really slowly, then the wisdom of the aesthetic can be a guiding practice in our everyday lives. The beauty of slow movement is that it is accessible in any moment. Slow movement can be a guiding practice in your everyday life, a habit of centering. Naturally, there's a time and a place for everything, and it might not be a good idea to be moving slowly like a sloth at your next job interview or on a first date. But even just a few moments of moving slowly can transport you into a valuable liminal moment. Slow movement helps me occupy my liminal space, to widen the gap between stimulus and response and carry impulse along an empowered path towards desired action in the world. I don't always get it right. Of course, most of the time I falter. And I'm okay with that, because every single moment is an opportunity to reboot and to start the performance again. I found my voice by slowing down. I invite you to slow down with me. Would you like to experience a liminal moment? Great. Well, let's try this. So I invite you to take both your hands and hold them out in front of you, just gently loose. In a moment, I'm going to clap my hands and the exercise will begin. First, I'd like to set the exercise up. So with your one hand, it doesn't matter which one, you're going to perform this movement, clenching your hand into a fist and then opening it again. With your other hand, you're simply going to touch your nose and bring your hand back, so that performed together, it looks like this. However, I'm going to give you 1 minute to do that exercise only once. I'm going to clap my hand, the exercise will begin, and when I clap my hand again, it will be over. Do it slowly, slowly. Drop into the moment and connect with your breath. These words. These words originate from a yogi recluse living in India, the Dakini Lalita Devi. Slowness is something universal. We have only become unaccustomed to it. Slowness, constancy, and harmony of movement, and our consciousness arises. The body begins to find joy in each small thing. We are attentive and wide awake. We sense the complete and absolute freshness of the world. We communicate. We open our senses to the abundance of being. I'm a beginner in slow movement, and I always will be, because there's nothing to achieve and nowhere to go, except deeper and deeper into my sensory experience. And in this way, a whole new sensory world emerges, and the universe inside my body comes alive. Will you find yourself in liminal space? Can you sense what wants to be born? What is your theater? Thank you.